Well, hello, friends. I am so excited to have a conversation with the Reverend Teresa Welborn, who's my district superintendent. She's a district superintendent in the Rio, Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church. She serves the capital area, which includes the Austin, Texas area. And we're going to have a conversation that I really hope is a blessing and encouragement to all, but particularly to leaders in the church. Uh, Teresa and I both have an opportunity to watch our colleagues and to see kind of what's been happening during the COVID-19 pandemic to the church and to leaders from a different perspective. And our hope is that our conversation here would be an encouragement to pastors, to lay leaders, to people who've been wondering about how all of this affects the church. One note is that this isn't a technical conversation about how to adjust in these times, as much as it is reflections and conversation about maybe what will be happening now, but also in months and even years to come. So we truly hope it's a blessing. Teresa, welcome. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining me in this time.
Thank you, Ray. I'm grateful for you and your ministry. It's an honor to be here.
Well, good. One thing that I noticed early on when the kind of shutdown began and churches weren't able to meet anymore, I'm in an appointment that is not in a local church at the moment. I'm planning new faith communities. I had this room to be able to pray and to be able to kind of pause and kind of in the midst of all this disorientation in those first couple weeks to kind of slow down a little bit, to start carrying some of the grief that was happening. And then as I talked to pastor friends after week 1 and week 2, I started to hear stories about how overwhelmingly stressful it was for so many of them to
Right.
make all these transitions. And so I'm interested, as a district superintendent, you were in touch with so many different colleagues in ministry, and to kind of talk about how they were able or not able to engage the grief and engage that those first couple weeks and all the stress that was there.
Right. Well, I think I have a similar experience just in my role as a district superintendent. I'm not there preaching and doing all the local church things Sunday by Sunday. And so I as well, I feel like had time to carry and begin processing some of my own grief that I was experiencing at the beginning of this season of sheltering in place. And certainly seeing pastors working so hard, doing amazing work with their lay staff, with their lay volunteers to make Sunday morning worship happen and all the other things during the week. And I do wonder and even worry about where the space is for them to just rest in God and to begin processing their own grief experience during that time.
Yeah, I've also thought about, so I think about that because these are my friends, colleagues in ministry or pastors.
Right.
I care about them. These are people I walk alongside with for years and years in an itinerant system. They're my friends, like I said. But I also think about it from a leadership point of view, that as pastors, and this is, I think, very true of lay leadership too. I want to throw that out there because I know there's been a lot of lay leaders in local churches who have also been pressed into adjusting in this moment, and it's been very stressful. But it also comes into how we lead the body of Christ, and so maybe speaking more into why do you think it was that we couldn't pray as much as maybe we were being invited to? We couldn't grieve as much as we were wanting to. We couldn't rest in the moment of disorientation, and then that also didn't allow us to help our people in our churches maybe do that as well. Of course, there's not one answer to that question, Teresa, about why was this a problem, but just maybe help open up some of the reasons why for local pastors we were just in the moment weren't able to do that.
Sure. And I think you're exactly right. There's not just one thing, and it's complex. But at the risk of perhaps being bold and just kind of putting it out there, at the end of the day, our local churches, the lay leaders, the pastors, they know that there's bills to get paid. There's the air conditioning unit that's on the fritz, and that's not an inexpensive repair. There's how is the pastor going to get paid? How how are any number of things going to continue to operate? And this might sound like I'm kind of living in la la land, but I do have moments in my daydreaming and wondering throughout the day, what would it look like if we didn't have to worry about these things? Would we have been able to truly let go and take that time to surrender to God and listen and just be?
Yeah, I think this something I haven't mentioned, which you know is true as well, is the varied experiences that pastors and leaders in the church have had through this moment. I did talk to a colleague recently who this has been refreshing for them. It's been an opportunity to focus on some of their strengths in ways that they weren't able to before the pandemic. So I know it's not true for all of us, but yeah, that's a truth. I think another pressure that besides the financial one, and I think it's related to this financial one, is that suddenly congregations had more visible and direct needs. And so if you're a pastor who's trying to be have your parish be your city or be the neighborhood around the church, or if you have outreach and mission that you're really engaged in the midst of a kind of crisis,
Right.
this is very human in communities. We become inwardly focused, and suddenly the needs of those within the body become the most urgent and pressing needs. Do you think that also has been a part of where that stress has come from and that demand?
I definitely imagine that that's probably part of it. One of the things that I think about when I imagine all that the local church pastors are carrying is, again, expectations that are placed on them by any number of people, including themselves, right?
Right.
And so I was talking to some pastors that, they felt like they were trying to get ready for some type of online worship presence because their church had never done that before.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that pressure. And then they began hearing from people in their congregation, well, we're doing Facebook Live, but this church over there is doing this YouTube service ahead of time, and that seems really good, and maybe we need to do both. And then the pastor's thinking to themselves, I also know that my colleague across town has started a podcast, and I
Yep.
probably need to be doing that as well. And, somewhere it says we can't be all things to all people, and just having that sense of space to truly discern what is it that God's calling me to be and to do in this moment. I think not only are our clergy uniquely called and uniquely gifted, but I believe that about our local churches as well, and that we don't have to all do this the same way.
Yeah, you touch on something in your comments right there that came to my mind, that we had another pandemic before this one, and this is kind of cheesy, but it's competitiveness in the church is this like virus that sometimes has flare-ups. And so every time there's a new innovation in the church, I remember contemporary worship coming into the church
Yeah, right.
years and years
Oh,
ago, and
goodness.
every
Yes.
church had to figure out, how are we going to do this good enough or best, depending on where you see yourself as a church in the
Mm-hmm.
pecking order. And it's so weird how I talk to colleagues, and we're all aware that this isn't what God is calling of us, to be competitive and to be better than our neighbor churches or even our colleagues in ministry that are, we work with regularly. And yet here we are again, there's this moment of crisis and innovation where we're trying to adjust and shift. And it felt like there was competitiveness. And I contrast that with a frustration I had. I'd love you to speak to this. Again, this was probably about a month, and I kind of had this thought. I go, why did we, each church, have to reinvent the wheel on this, when I'm seeing some churches just like this is second skin for them? They just eased into online worship and ministering through all these different platforms. This is just what they do. And then I'm watching a lot of colleagues have to just go through so much to do, just get on board with this stuff. And I
Right.
thought, why couldn't we have hindsight's 2020? We couldn't, because we were all figuring this out. But if we could do it again, couldn't we have collaborated a little differently? Couldn't we have had churches or pastors who were great at phone chains and checking in with people in need that are vulnerable, working with several churches across an appointment, and people who are great at preaching online, doing that across, I know this is crazy, doing that for several different churches, or people with
Right.
amazing children in their youth ministry, helping churches do that across appointments. I thought about that. So talk about the competitiveness,
Yeah.
and then the call and invitation to collaboration a little bit.
Sure. As one of my colleagues I heard say about a month ago, how can we be connectional for real?
Yeah.
And I was visiting with some clergy about a possibility of, what would it look like if we didn't all have to figure out this worship thing on a
Yeah.
Sunday morning and occasionally worshiped together. Like, imagine that, United Methodists throughout the city, throughout the area, worshiping together. And we've already named in this conversation, it's not all about money, but it was interesting that was the sticking point of, like, how do we take up the offering? What does it mean? Because we need the money in our local church. And so that was interesting. I have seen moments, not as much as we'd like, of course, but I've seen these moments of lay people at one church I happen to know. They had not ever done live streaming or online worship. And they had seen that a church across town had already had that going long before COVID-19. And so they reached out to the pastor, who put them in touch with their AV person. And so there was some resource
Wow.
sharing. Of course, we want to see more and more of that. And I think that's one of the important roles that I have, of trying to connect churches more together. I think that we still have a lot to learn about what it means for us to worship together. As well as I do, our churches are often very unique in the worship style and, quote
Yep,
unquote, how
that's
people
true.
get fed spiritually. And yet, what could be possible if we did more worship together? I also think, when I think about collaboration and being connectional for real, that beyond worship, I look at some of the mission opportunities and the program resourcing, where we could truly be stronger and better together if we pulled things together. I was in a conversation just last week where one of our churches that does a really strong homeless ministry, they were talking about how they needed more volunteers during this time, because they were still trying to make their ministry happen to these people in need. And in the conversation, it was just beautiful to see other pastors at other churches say, "Are you kidding? I hear from lay people all the time that during this time of sheltering in place, they feel helpless. They want to do something."
Mm.
And so you have the ministry opportunity and you need people. Well, I have people. And so rather than us reinventing our own ministry around that
Right.
matter, why don't we deploy? And we don't know about that unless we're talking to each other. Another example I think of is around children's ministry. Early on in my time as a district superintendent, we had children's ministry directors together, as well as lay volunteers in some of our churches that don't have paid staff, to just, share best practices. What are you doing throughout the year? And there was a wonderful full-time children's director that had told me the day before, I'm not planning to go to that meeting because I don't need it.
Mm.
And I said, I know, but we need you. And
Mm.
what might you have as far as resources to help out with some of our smaller churches that don't have paid lay staff in those areas? So I think, again, we still have a lot of learning and a lot of work to do in collaboration.
Sure. And I mean, all the things we've talked about, it's been, we've kind of been nitpicking on some of or I have been, the struggles that this has revealed. And I think it's important to recognize that these shortcomings or challenges that we've seen in this moment are really rooted in some ways that we do church, some assumptions we have about what the church is. Um, and for instance, you mentioned, we have an assumption about church that what it is that we have all these smaller churches that each do worship a little differently, and that's kind of the identity that
Right.
we rally around as a local community. And that's what makes it my church. I'm sure, there are many other things beside worship. There's personalities and culture
Mhm.
that does that, but it's still, there's this idea that church is about the affiliation or the associations I make, the relationships I have. And this has challenged that, because suddenly now we're in our neighborhoods, now we're in our homes, now we are connecting online with people that maybe we didn't connect to before. It's changed our sense of place and our sense of community. And so I think this has been an opportunity to think about the church differently. We talked about our economic system as the church. How are pastors provided for? I think we should really continue to ask that question. Is this
Absolutely.
model we have the only way? For instance, I'm in a situation where I'm trying every day to think, how could I, as a pastor that's outside of the walls, be funded? That's not just by grants, that's not just by donations, that's by partnerships, that's by vocational
Mhm.
ministry. We need to continue to have those kind of conversations so
I
that
agree.
pastors can be free to grieve and lead their people in grieving, be free to pray and lead their people in praying, be free to rest and lead their people in resting. But anyway, we could go on all these different things about ecclesiology. And,
Right.
we were talking earlier, I think you just said something beautiful, that we don't often get asked, what is our ecclesiology as pastors, enough. And this moment has really asked us, what do we believe about the church and what it is, hasn't it?
Right. Absolutely. I think back, and it was many, many years ago when I went through the ordination process, and I remember those doctrinal exams we had to write and the interview questions and being asked about, um, atonement theory and lots of other big, meaty theological words. And I wasn't asked about ecclesiology. What does it mean to be the church? And again, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a pastor in this district just recently. And they were talking about, the governor's recent
Mhm.
sharings about beginning to lift sheltering in place in various places to some extent. And so their congregation, the leaders are asking the question, when will we know that it's the right time for us to worship in person again on a Sunday morning in the sanctuary? And this pastor just happens to be in a congregation where the lay leaders are telling her, we do not see any benefit right now when we know that the curve is not flattened, that cases continue to increase. We know that there's not a vaccine yet. Like, we do not see any benefit from gathering the way we did before. And as this pastor is
Mm.
talking, I thought to myself, what's the benefit to going back at all? And being able to ask, that might sound like
No,
a
it's
crazy question, but
time for crazy
being
questions.
able to ask that question for so many of us that are kind of just grew up in the church, and that's just part of who we are. We go to the church sanctuary on Sunday morning. Why? Like, what is the benefit? Who are we as a community? And I've never seen, Ray, I've never seen in my 6 years as a district superintendent such energy from pastors throughout the week who are texting me or emailing me to say, Teresa, you would not imagine how many online worshipers we had, people that we don't know, which I think is another thing we're still learning about. What does that
Mhm.
mean? Part of what I think it means is that people are curious about us. I think it dismantles some of our assumptions that, in today's society, people aren't interested in us. They don't want to have anything to do with the church. Well, people are clearly either curious about us or curious about faith or spirituality or the gospel. They may not want to come to the building for a host of reasons and all that that embodies. But what does it mean to be transformed as a body by these people that we are just now coming into contact with? I think it's interesting, something you said earlier about how there's this kind of internal pressure, even though we're getting ready for all these online worship experiences. A lot of the way that we do online worship comes from the internal pressures of the existing local church. And yet there's all these people from the outside that are starting to connect. I believe firmly that's part of what God is using to transform us.
Amen.
And how do we connect more with these people that are listening in on worship or participating
And
with
allow
us?
the new connections we're making because of online ministry to teach us about who we are called to be as the church. Are we willing to do that? If a little window has opened with new connections in our community that challenges our assumptions about church, do we have the courage to listen to the Spirit of God through our new neighbors that we connected to because of this pandemic, to lead us into a future that might look a little different.
Right.
I think about this in terms of discipleship, family ministries, neighborhood ministries outside of our churches. This is something I really care about, is equipping and empowering everyday Christians in the places where they live and work and play to be the body of Christ. And this has been a unique moment, I think, and this is probably one of my deepest hopes and my deepest frustrations. That coin has two sides, to say, hey, this is our chance as church people. I'm a church person, to really say, hey, church can't happen right now in the church, the building, and through the programs and ministries we're used to. And so another way that ecclesiology is shifting maybe in our imaginations is to go, how do we have church around the table as a family? How do we have church with close friends if we're living alone? How do we have church? Who are we as the church in our neighborhood and on our street? What does church look like now that my job is remote and I have these relationships with people that I'm with a lot? Man, there seems like a rich opportunity, and I really don't want to miss this moment, or in the months and maybe years to come, the invitation to go, we can be the church beyond our walls a little bit better.
Amen. I can't agree with that more. I was, again, listening to a pastor as we were looking towards Easter and sharing in conversation with colleagues, how are we going to help our people prepare for Holy Week and Easter Sunday, knowing that they can't come to the building? And it was just beautiful to see these pastors saying, we've talked about spiritual disciplines in the home and living out our faith throughout the week. We've done some of that work in our churches, but man, we've missed opportunity to really give people these gifts, these resources, these tools to nurture their relationship with the people they live with, that they work with God throughout their daily week. And so it's been exciting to see those things. In my own home, I think like a lot of, like you said, church people, and maybe especially so with younger children. I remember early on, my daughter Claire and I would get online on Sunday morning to worship. And I told her, I said, we could open the laptop and worship in our pajamas and do it even in bed. And that's okay. Like, no judgment if that's how you want to do it. But I said, I wonder what it would look like to, let's either use the kitchen table or the coffee table. And we have various candles and crosses and, just different symbols of our religious faith. We had a palm branch during Holy Week. And that's a thing for her now. I mean, Sunday morning worship online doesn't happen without Claire digging underneath the coffee table for the box of all of our worship pieces. I rarely was one of those pastors. I rarely lit a candle before meetings. And it was a colleague that I learned the practice from. Okay, a Zoom call, a phone call meeting at home, light a candle, make it holy. And these are practices we could have been doing all along. And I'm excited to see the way that we can deepen those practices.
Yeah. And I echo in my own family some of those experiences. God has given us a chance to claim spaces and times and people and places where people connect differently. And that's beautiful. Our kitchen table became a place during Holy Week that it had never been before, because we put candles on there and blew them out on a tenebrae service. Or our living room on Sunday mornings that's where Sunday school happens. And here I am, a pastor, and I'm having conversations with my children about the scriptures after Easter that I've never had before. And they're engaged for 40 minutes, jumping on and we have a little trampoline. So it's in the house, and they're a little one, and we're talking about Thomas and the kids
Thomas on the trampoline.
Yeah, Thomas
I
on
love
the trampoline, and just realizing, no, this is a space. And then a Zoom call with some of my neighbors. That's a Bible study that I honestly wouldn't have invited people to be a part of a Bible study in my neighborhood at this point. But because of this, now this is a new space that I see God working in. And so I think as pastors, but this is happening across the board in people's work lives, there's this integration. We like, there's used to siloing our lives that organizes it for us, and it keeps things tidy and clean. And there's been, for many people, of smashing together of personal life and professional life, but that's happening for pastors. But I also think it's happening for lay people as I think about church. Church isn't a place we just go. It's something we have to be and who we are here and now. And I think that's a gift. I think it's a challenge. And so you kind of spoke to that. I don't know if there's more you could say about it.
Oh, well, no, just that I completely agree. And I think it's messy, and it can be uncomfortable and new when you talk about those worlds coming together, but perhaps that's just as it should be. And again, invitation for God to teach us new things about ourselves and those we either live with or work with, and God.
Amen. Well, I want to give you a chance. I know you love to encourage people, a chance to encourage those who might be listening to this. And you've already done this in so many ways through the call, shared stories of where you're seeing colleagues in ministry being innovative and kind of bringing hope about our future, but just giving us your word of hope, your word of how you're seeing the Spirit of God leading us to be a more creative and open church as the world changes. I want to give you a chance to do that.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, if there's anything I could say to clergy and to our lay people who work so hard to be the church in the world today, just a sincere thank you, thank you, thank you. As I said earlier in our conversation, it's hard work to be the church. It's a challenging time for a host of reasons. And yet for those who are called, it's worth all of the hard stuff. And so I just want to say thank you. Our local church pastors, our lay staff, our local church volunteers that are working so hard and in a creative, adaptive ways to bring worship experiences on Sunday morning, to offer opportunities to deepen their church members' faith throughout the week. I mean this seriously. I think that every week, often every day, I see churches and clergy do something that I never would have thought of doing. That's a word of encouragement for their lay people, or a way to connect during this time when we have to be apart physically. So I'm the one that's encouraged when I see the creativity and the risks that people are willing to make. And so I just appreciate that so much. It's been a good thing for me to see the way that our clergy are connecting with one another. You referenced just kind of before the pandemic, people kind of looking towards, at least United Methodist, looking towards May and General Conference and everything. And at least from where I sit, I have seen pastors moving towards one another in a way that I don't think that they had in the months before. And I hope that if any clergy are listening to this and they're not in some sort of small group with other pastors, let me know so I can connect you. But I've been trying to create space for clergy to just come together and support one another, maybe share ideas, that sort of thing. And a lot of times when I reach out to pastors early on, weeks ago, they were like, oh yeah, I've got my group. And so they were already thinking of doing this, and I'm encouraged to see that. I also pray and hope and trust that some of our pastors and lay people are seeing their relevance. And I don't mean the relevance of the bricks and mortar and all the things about being the church in the institutional way, but the very living body of Christ in the world today that is an agent of transformation and that transforms us when we give ourselves fully to it, that there's real meaning for that. I think that one of the many layers that leads to clergy burnout is just, we know that it's a profession that's lowering in respect in our society, that there's a host of people that may not feel like the church is relevant or that it has a a meaning or purpose in the world today. And I think through this experience, for so many reasons and in so many ways, we're seeing that God has a purpose and a plan for them. There's people online wanting to connect with you, to say, how can I find some peace? How can I find some comfort during the midst of this pandemic? People are searching. People are wanting to connect, and so I pray that people are sensing that in our local churches.
Amen. And something I've been encouraged by, not just on this call with you, but in conversations with you prior to this, is that, I mean, you're a district superintendent. You represent for us as pastors and as leaders in the church, someone closer to the center of the institution, and to be able to talk to you and have permission to ask big questions, that sometimes are questions that come out of frustration and anger, even with an institution that is an institution, so it comes with all kinds of struggles. But some of these questions are aches from the Spirit about things we've talked about and touched on today that are big questions about the paradigms we operate in and the assumptions we have. And to be on a call with you as my DS and say, no, it's okay to ask these questions. It does mean there's tension. We do walk forward, holding the church as it is, but we also are holding these questions and taking them seriously because we know that God is with us in the questions, and that the future is with us in these questions. And so I encourage pastors, people in churches who feel those aching questions about the way and how this pandemic has revealed and maybe bubbled up some of those big questions. I feel like we need a place to be able to continue to ask and explore them. And we need to be able to do that together, no matter where we are in relationship to the institution. That's how we will move forward as God's people. And so anyway, you've encouraged me and those who've been able to listen to ask those questions, even in the midst of the great tension that we hold them in. So thank you. Thank you for this.
Ray, the way you say that, thank you, that the way you're articulating that reminds me, and this may not be everybody's experience, but I don't think I'm alone of thinking of, I was a philosophy minor in college, and then I went to seminary, and I remember moments of sitting in the dormitory with my friends, thinking our deep thoughts, asking the big questions in life, who am I? What does all of this mean? And then going off to seminary and continuing, we ask those big, hard questions that are complex, that don't have easy answers. And I go back to, I think of our clergy, and even lay people, of course, have calls. And I think of our clergy especially, and that first spark where they began to sense that God was calling them into this. And one of the things I believe that God is inviting us into is just to revisit that call and revisit that spark. And when was the last time you just sat around with a couple of friends? Maybe it has to be on a Zoom call or phone call now, but asking those big, complicated questions that aren't going to be all tied up in a neat bow, but give space for those, because in the day-to-day work of the church as we know it, if we don't create that space, it's not there, because of all the things. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
I appreciate the way you articulated that. It reminds me of my own need to visit those questions.
Well, I hope that those who have been a part of listening to this today will know that we are both places where we want that conversation to continue. I feel in part that our bishop and you, Teresa, and others have given, part of my appointment is a place of allowing somebody to ask those questions and invite other people to have questions around that. So I just offer myself as a colleague for those who may not feel like they have other places to really get into those big questions about the church and its future. And I love having those conversations and trying to gather what we learn. We're all doing research here to try to follow God into an unknown future. So what we know is that God holds it, and thanks be to God. Teresa, for your leadership, for your time with me today, for sharing your heart, I give you thanks. And I hope we get to circle back around in a few months and talk more about the things we've learned And we probably won't have all the answers then like we don't now, but the conversation is worth it. So thank
We
you.
might have more questions too.
We
So
will.
yeah, thank you again so much for the time,
Well, peace be with you.
and also with you.